TDW is June 25th, 1876, and we find ourselves along the banks of the Little Bighorn River, known to the Lakota Sioux as the Valley of the Greasy Grass. Here, Crazy Horse can already sense triumph. As Cheyenne and Lakota warriors crush Custer's men by the riverside, Crazy Horse and his Lakota fighters swing north along the ridge, cutting off any path of retreat. When Custer's troops try to fall back across the uneven terrain, they're unknowingly retreating straight into a deadly trap. What happens next is difficult to piece together, except for one undeniable truth. It was a massacre. Custer and his men, desperate, pile the bodies of their slain horses into crude barricades to form a last line of defense. Their resistance doesn't last long. Within minutes, every one of the 210 soldiers under Custer's command lies dead, struck down in the chaos and fury on the hilltop, or hunted through the surrounding ravines and bluffs. Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Chief Gall, and some 2,500 Lakota, Dakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors have achieved a resounding victory. The atrocities committed at Sand Creek, Washita, and Mankato have finally been avenged. For the moment, the Lakota have reasserted their rightful claim to their lands, and the united tribes of the Great Plains have succeeded in defeating the U.S. Army. Yet in celebrating this triumph, they have unknowingly sealed their fate. Within a year, the United States government will seize the lands guaranteed to the Lakota by the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The Lakota and Cheyenne will be forced onto reservations, their culture and traditions systematically suppressed. Sitting Bull will flee north to Canada, while Crazy Horse will die under controversial circumstances while resisting arrest. Adding insult to tragedy, Custer, the architect of his own destruction, will be glorified by the American public. For generations afterward, George Armstrong Custer will be immortalized in school books, novels, and films as a heroic figure of the frontier. The same man who orchestrated the Washita massacre, whose arrogance led to the deaths of over 200 men, including his own teenage nephew, will become an American icon. Meanwhile, the Lakota and Cheyenne victory will fade into obscurity, their warriors branded as savages, a label used to justify the brutal campaigns and oppression that followed. This is the tale of Custer's last stand beside the Little Bighorn River, but it is also the story of how the triumphant Cheyenne and Lakota Sioux, in their own way, fought their final stand alongside him. It all began in the late spring of 1876, when the Lakota and Cheyenne gathered for their sacred Sundance ceremony at Rosebud Creek in the Montana Territory. The Sundance acted as a powerful symbol of unity for the many tribes of the Great Plains, providing them an opportunity to gather for weeks of spiritual renewal and sacred ceremony. Around June 5th, the Lakota spiritual leader, Sitting Bull, emerged deeply shaken from his own Sundance. During the intense ritual, he had fallen into a trance and experienced a vivid and alarming vision. Enemy soldiers were falling into his camp like swarms of grasshoppers from the sky. It was a haunting image, and receiving it during such a solemn and spiritually charged ceremony would have left Sitting Bull deeply disturbed. Yet how could it possibly come true? After all, under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, this land had been guaranteed to the Lakota. It was legally theirs, even under U.S. law, but the prophecy was already beginning to unfold. The Black Hills Gold Rush of 1874 had brought waves of settlers and miners flooding into Lakota territory in search of riches. Among the earliest arrivals were 1,000 troopers of the 7th U.S. Cavalry Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Lieutenant, if you're American. Custer was equal parts soldier and showman. Famous for his flamboyant style and long golden hair, he relished being the center of attention. Though he had proven his skill on occasion, notably at Gettysburg, where he earned distinction and even received a flag of truce from General Lee's retreating forces, his arrogance was legendary. He was known to wear an ostrich plume in his hat and write self-glorifying newspaper articles about his exploits. Custer held little respect for Native Americans, especially the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne. He should have understood them better. He had every chance to. In early March 1869, he met with the Southern Cheyenne, welcomed by leaders Little Robe, and medicine arrows, who treated him with hospitality and trust. But Custer betrayed that trust, taking 4 of their warriors captive. To be fair, after his earlier actions, Little Robe and Medicine Arrows should have seen it coming. The betrayal wasn't new for Custer. The year before, at the Washita River, he had attacked the Cheyenne under Chief Black Kettle, killing an unknown number of warriors and massacring women and children, even using some as human shields. By 1876, Custer had become inseparable from the story of the Great Sioux War, a conflict that would ultimately claim his own life, intertwined with that of the Lakota and Cheyenne he despised. Yet Custer was not the highest-ranking officer in the campaign. That honor belonged to Generals George Crook and Alfred Terry. In fact, General Crook launched the first engagement of the summer. On June 17th, at Twinan, Rosebud Creek, his forces, supported by their Crow and Shoshone allies, clashed fiercely with crazy horses of warriors in a hard-fought battle. Despite winning the battle, General Crook was unsettled by the sheer number and intensity of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors he had faced. Fearing a counterattack, he chose to retreat from the battlefield. From that moment, 2 things became abundantly clear to the U.S. Army commanders. First, there were massive numbers of native warriors concentrated in the region. Second, there was almost certainly a large encampment nearby, most likely along the Bighorn or Little Bighorn River, for Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry Regiment. The second fact was all that mattered. Ignoring the lesson of Crook's cautious withdrawal at Rosebud Creek, Custer pressed forward recklessly, supported by Captain Frederick Benteen and Major Marcus Reno. Determined to strike first, he declined the offer of Gatling guns, reasoning they would only slow his advance, the first of several fatal mistakes. Within days, Custer's scouts spotted the Cheyenne and Lakota encampment. When they returned, their faces were pale with fear. Mitch Boyer, a seasoned frontiersman of French-Canadian and Santee Sioux heritage, warned that it was the largest village he had seen in 3 decades. The one Crow scout, half yellow-face, grimly told Custer, "You and I are going home today by a road we do not know." If those words disturbed Custer, he gave no sign. Instead of waiting for General Terry's column to arrive, he divided his force and began his assault on June 25th. Benteen was ordered to remain in reserve, while Reno would cross the river and attack the camp from the Yalam. Custer himself led 5 companies along the ridge north of the river, intending to strike from higher ground. From there, he saw the enormous village, with his own eyes, stretching nearly 3 miles across and filled with thousands of lodges. It was then that Custer scribbled his now famous message to Benteen. "Benteen, come on! Big village, be quick, bring packs, greater than PS, bring packs," but instead of waiting for reinforcements, Custer made his second grave error, pressing forward along the ridge on his own. According to reports, he shouted, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them. We'll finish them up and then go home." It sounded arrogant, even for Custer, but it was in character. He was ever the wine showman, with newspaper correspondents accompanying him, eager to witness his next great triumph. Meanwhile, Reno's 3 companies began their own advance. Around 3 p.m., they crossed the Little Bighorn River and moved along its southern bank, setting the stage for the disastrous battle that was about to unfold. As Major Reno rounded a small grove of trees near the riverbank, he caught sight of the native encampment for the first time and realized it was far larger than he had anticipated. Acting quickly, he dismounted his troops and formed a mud skirmish line, ordering them to fire volleys toward the eastern edge of the vast village. From his elevated position to the north, it's likely that Custer could see Reno's advance and the flashes of rifle fire. His immediate decision to ride west at full speed suggests he had indeed spotted Reno's line and was attempting to circle around the camp. His apparent plan was to an attack from the west, driving the warriors toward Reno's troops. a classic hammer and anvil tactic. If that was his intention, it proved to be another deadly miscalculation. Reno's thin line wasn't strong enough to hold. Unbeknownst to both officers, a large number of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors had already gathered on the hills to Reno's left flank. They suddenly charged over the ridge, crashing into the side of Reno's position and quickly cutting off his retreat. Chaos broke out. Reno's men fell back in confusion, retreating only as far as the dense brush near the river. The warriors chose not to chase them into the thicket. Instead, they set it ablaze and fired into it in from nearby. By this point, Reno, possibly under the influence of alcohol and showing signs of panic, was losing his grip. His Arikara scout, Bloody Knife, who was well known and hated by the Lakota, was targeted and shot in the head as he stood beside Reno. The impact splattered blood and bone across the officer's face. The horrifying sight reportedly caused Reno to snap completely. In his confusion, he gave contradictory orders, telling his men to mount, then dismount, and then mount again, while the warriors continued to fire relentlessly into the woods. Finally, Reno commanded a full withdrawal, and his rattled soldiers fled in disorder. They broke from the tree line and raced northeast, following the river's curve before crossing the Little Bighorn and scrambling for cover in a nearby ravine. Many of the wounded were left behind, and stragglers were cut down by pursuing warriors. The Cheyenne fighters, now emboldened, closed in, dragging soldiers from their horses and beating them to death with clubs. As Reno and the survivors struggled up the ridge, they encountered Captain Benteen, who had been advancing under Custer's earlier orders. Benteen was stunned by the sight. Roughly 40 of Reno's 140 men were dead, and survivors were scattered along the route of retreat. Before Benteen could fully grasp the situation, the distant roar of gunfire, and on shouts from the west row made it clear that once or night, Custer was now heavily engaged, in battle. The warriors who had been chasing Reno suddenly turned westward, eager to join the fighting. Why Reno and Benteen failed to move forward in support of Custer remains uncertain. Reno was mentally shattered and likely incapable of making sound decisions, while Benteen, despite having direct orders from Custer, chose not to advance, effectively defying his superior at a crucial moment. Benteen held his position, focusing on reinforcing Reno's battered troops rather than moving forward to assist Custer. For reasons that remain unclear, no support ever reached Custer's command, leaving his companies to fight and die alone. From Lakota and Cheyenne eyewitness accounts, the battle unfolded as follows. Custer and one of his companies broke away from the main column along the ridgeline and pursued a group of warriors down Medicine Tail Coulee, pushing all the way to the riverbank opposite the native camp. Meanwhile, Captain James Calhoun, Custer's brother-in-law, held the high ground and continued advancing west along the ridge. It's believed that Custer may have been attempting to capture women and children from the camp to use as human shields, a brutal tactic he had previously employed during the Washita River massacre. But this time, it failed. As Custer's men reached the river, they came under heavy fire from sharpshooters as across the water. After regrouping, they likely attempted to charge across in an effort to break into the camp. The assault nearly succeeded. That portion of the village was lightly defended. A warrior named White Cow Bull later claimed he saw Custer himself, leading the charge, riding beside a man resembling Mitch Boyer. Some witnesses reported that Custer may have been shot while crossing the river, and several troopers were certainly killed midstream. Accounts differ, but many agree that the attack was repelled, and the surviving soldiers were driven back up the coulee toward the ridge. The Northern Cheyenne woman, Buffalo Calf Road woman, even claimed to have knocked Custer from his horse during this retreat. However, since Custer had cut his distinctive long hair and removed his decorated jacket before the battle, it's likely that many Native Americans witnesses misidentified him. His body was later found on a nearby hilltop, suggesting that some of these reports were cases of mistaken identity. What is certain is that the men who reached the river fell back in confusion, retreating across the rugged ground below the ridge. until they regrouped with Calhoun's troops on the crest. By this time, Crazy Horse's warriors, returning from the rout of Reno's command, were circling wide to the west and north, closing in fast. Custer's detachment was about to be completely surrounded. The final moments came swiftly. Custer's force fragmented into at least 3 small groups. One cluster of soldiers, led by Captain Keogh, made a desperate stand where they stood, fighting to the last man as they were overrun. The remainder army fell back further west, toward the position now known as Last Stand Hill, where Custer and his men met their fate. Benteen chose to hold his ground, focusing on supporting Reno's broken units, instead of advancing to aid Custer. For reasons that remain uncertain, no reinforcements ever reached Custer's men, leaving them to fight and die on their own. From Lakota and Cheyenne eyewitness accounts, the final battle unfolded in this way. Custer, along with one of his companies, broke away from the main force on the ridgeline and chased a group of warriors down Medicine Tail Coulee, pushing all the way to the Little Bighorn River opposite the native encampment. Meanwhile, Captain James Calhoun, Custer's brother-in-law, held his position on higher ground and continued west along the ridge. It's believed that Custer's plan may have been to seize women and children from the village to use as bargaining chips or human shields, a ruthless tactic he had used before at Washita River. This time, though, the plan backfired. As his men reached the riverbank, they came under intense fire from native marksmen shooting from the far side. After regrouping briefly, they likely attempted a direct charge across the river. The move almost succeeded. The section of camp they faced was lightly defended. A warrior named White Cow Bull later claimed he saw a man he believed to be Custer himself, leading the charge, accompanied by someone matching Mitch Boyer's description. Some witnesses reported that Custer was shot during the crossing, and at least a few soldiers were killed midstream. Others said the attack was beaten back halfway across, forcing the survivors to retreat up the coulee. The Northern Cheyenne woman, Buffalo Calf Road woman, even claimed she knocked Custer from his horse during this fight. However, since Custer had cut off his trademark long blonde hair and removed his ornate jacket before the battle, it would have been difficult for the warriors to identify him accurately. His body was later discovered on the hilltop, suggesting that some of these sightings were cases of mistaken identity. What is certain is that the men who reached the river retreated across the rough ground beneath the ridge, eventually grouping with Calhoun's forces on the crest. At that same moment, Crazy Horse's warriors, having finished pursuing Reno's men, swung wide to the west and north, closing in from behind. Custer's troops were now surrounded. It's believed that Custer's battalion fell in at least 3 separate groups. Some of the men, rallying around Captain Keogh, made a final stand where they were, refusing to retreat as they were overwhelmed by the advancing warriors. The remaining soldiers withdrew further west, to the area now known as Last Stand Hill, where Custer and his men made their doomed final stand. At this point, Custer's force divided once more. E Company either tried to launch a desperate charge or retreat down the coulee on the western end of the ridge, racing toward the river. Meanwhile, Custer, along with his 2 brothers, his young nephew, and roughly 40 soldiers, stayed behind on the hill's crest to make their final stand. There, they piled the bodies of their dead horses into makeshift barricades, using them as crude cover while they fired back at the encircling warriors. Crazy Horse's contingent had now taken up position to the north, attacking along the ridgeline, while Chief Gall's warriors pressed from the south. With both flanks collapsing, any hope of escape was gone. Although Lakota and Cheyenne accounts recall heavy casualties among their own fighters, the final struggle could not have lasted long. Amid the chaos, smoke, and dust, the warriors stormed the hill and showed no mercy. The wounded were executed, their skulls smashed, scalps taken, and bodies mutilated. It was later said that Custer's brother Thomas had his heart cut out. a symbolic act of vengeance. By about 5:30 p.m., the Battle of the Little Bighorn was over for Custer's men. Meanwhile, to the east, Lakota and Cheyenne bands turned their focus on Benteen and Reno's surviving companies. Through the musk night and into the next day, the two officers endured repeated attacks, essentially besieged, until where General Terry's column arrived on June 27th to relieve them. Though Reno's last defense alongside Benteen helped partly redeem his reputation, the label of coward followed him for years afterward, not entirely fairly. Despite accusations of drunkenness, Reno had been badly beaten and deeply shaken. After his rout at the riverbank, he likely believed his battered force couldn't effectively aid Custer. Still, his career was marred by scandal and alcoholism, and he was eventually dishonorably discharged, dying in 1889, his reputation destroyed. Benteen's detachment, though somewhat stronger, would have struggled to reach Custer in time, as the colonel had ridden too far ahead, chasing glory instead of coordinating with his men. Ironically, among all the U.S. commanders at Little Bighorn, it was Custer's reputation that emerged the most glorified, at least initially. In the years following the massacre, George Armstrong Custer was transformed into an American icon, celebrated as a hero of courage and valor, despite the fact that his reckless ambition had cost over 200 men their lives. Much of this myth-making can be credited to his wife, Libby Bacon Custer, who became his chief publicist. Almost immediately after his death, she published A Popular Life of General Custer, the first in a series of works that would cement his legend for generations to come. In 1885, Libby Custer published Boots and Saddles, a work that, along with her earlier books, helped to shape the legend of the gallant soldier who led fearlessly from the front and died bravely beside his men. When Frederick Benteen condemned Custer's recklessness and his careless sacrifice of his troops, Libby immediately fired back with a one pamphlet defending her husband's honor. The American public, moved by the grieving widow's words, chose to believe her version of events over the criticism of a fellow officer who had fought alongside Custer. When it came to choosing between truth and legend, Americans at the time embraced the legend. According to journalist Olivia B. Waxman, another reason Custer became such a symbol of bravery in the face of death lies in the fact that no one from his 5 companies survived. Even Mark Kellogg, the Bismarck Tribune journalist accompanying the expedition, was killed at Little Bighorn. With no survivors left to tell the story, the battle became shrouded in mystery, leaving space for myth-making and reinterpretation over the years. And reinterpret it they did, with Libby Custer leading efforts to restore her husband's reputation. The image of Custer as a Wakan heroic martyr grew stronger over time. Well into the 20th century, Hollywood films featuring actors like Annie Errol Flynn and Robert Shaw helped to immortalize Custer as an icon of courage and sacrifice. Even today, though his arrogance and vanity are widely recognized, many people still view his final stand as an act of heroic defiance, rather than the disastrous misjudgment it was. But what of the Lakota and Cheyenne, the victors of the battle? Their triumph at Little Bighorn was their first and only major success in the Great Sioux War, and by early 1877, the conflict had ended, disastrously for them. As historian Lindsay Stallone's Marshalls explains, Custer's defeat prompted the U.S. government to act decisively to protect innocent settlers from so-called native aggressors. The native warriors who were defending their lands were to cast as villains, standing in the way of America's westward expansion. What few textbooks emphasize, however, is that those settlers were there illegally. The Black Hills and surrounding territory had been guaranteed to the Lakota Nation forever under a U.S. treaty law. The native fighters were therefore defending what was rightfully theirs, yet in 1876, such truths were largely ignored. Americans who read about the battle reacted not with empathy, but with horniter adaran hakin. Reports that native warriors had taken scalps and trophies, the traditional practice of victory, only deepened the stereotype of the washed savage Indian who needed to be civilized. Ironically, just 12 years earlier, Colonel John Chivington's Colorado cavalry had massacred and mutilated the peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho people at Sand Creek, 1864, committing the very same acts they now condemned. Yet this atrocity was soon forgotten, while Custer's death was glorified for generations as a tale of noble sacrifice. In 1885, Libby Custer published Boots and Saddles, a work that, along with her earlier books, helped to shape the legend of the gallant soldier who led fearlessly from the front and died bravely beside his men. When Frederick Benteen condemned Custer's recklessness and his careless sacrifice of his troops, Libby immediately fired back with a barricade pamphlet defending her husband's honor. The American public, moved by the grieving widow's words, chose to believe her version of events over the criticism of a fellow officer who had fought alongside Custer. When it came to choosing between truth and legend, Americans at the time embraced the legend. According to journalist Olivia B. Waxman, another reason Custer became such a symbol of bravery in the face of death lies in the fact that no one from his 5 companies survived. Even Mark Kellogg, the Bismarck Tribune journalist accompanying the expedition, was killed at Little Bighorn. With no survivors left to tell the story, the battle became shrouded in mystery, leaving space for myth-making and reinterpretation over the years. And reinterpret it they did. With Libby Custer leading efforts to restore her husband's reputation, the image of Custer as a heroic martyr grew stronger over time. Well into the 20th century, Hollywood films is featuring actors like Errol Flynn and Robert Shaw helped to immortalize Custer as an icon of courage and sacrifice. Even today, though his arrogance and vanity are widely recognized, many people still view his final stand as an act of heroic defiance, rather than the disastrous misjudgment it was. But what of the Lakota and Cheyenne, the victors of the battle? Their triumph at Little Bighorn was their first and only major success in the Great Sioux War, and by early 1877, the conflict had ended disastrously for them. As historian Lindsay Stallone's Marshall explains, Custer's defeat prompted the U.S. government to act decisively to protect innocent rank settlers from so-called native aggressors. The native warriors who were not defending their lands were not cast as villains, standing in the way of America's westward expansion. What few textbooks emphasize, however, is that those settlers were there illegally. The Black Hills and surrounding territory had been guaranteed to the Lakota Nation forever, under unknowingly treaty law. The native fighters were therefore defending what was rightfully theirs. Yet in 1876, such truths were largely ignored. Americans who read about the battle reacted not with empathy, but with an outrage. Reports that native warriors had taken scalps and trophies, traditional practice of victory, only deepened the stereotype of the savage Indian who needed to be civilized. Ironically, just 12 years earlier, Colonel John Chivington's Colorado cavalry had massacred and mutilated peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho people at Sand Creek, 1864, committing the very same acts they now condemned. Yet this atrocity was soon forgotten, while Custer's death was glorified for generations as a tale of noble sacrifice. Those gruesome trophies were displayed in Denver saloons for years after the massacre, a chilling reminder of how violence was glorified in the name of conquest. There's no denying that Custer and his men met a horrific end. Their final moments were filled with fear and despair, as the realization struck that there would be no escape this time. They must have watched in horror as friends and comrades fell one after another. The Custer brothers may have even witnessed the death and mutilation of their young nephew, Henry Reed, before their very eyes. Yet scenes like these were not uncommon in warfare. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors fought fiercely, showing no mercy to enemies they knew would have shown them none in return. And from a WAM military standpoint, Their actions could even be seen as, durami, justified. But the way history was told made all the difference. The Lakota and Cheyenne preserved their past through oral tradition, in stories, songs, and memory. The Americans, however, wrote theirs down, spreading it through newspapers and magazines, crafting narratives that echoed around the world. They twisted the truth, turning reality into myth, painting the native warriors as savages, and declaring that the West needed to be civilized. In the end, what should have been remembered as a worse, remarkable victory for the Lakota and Cheyenne instead became the beginning of their downfall, the moment their triumph was rewritten into tragedy.